Okay, Biology 100. Welcome to our last unit for this semester, all about ecology. It's going to be chapters 16, 17, and 18. But for this week, we're going to be focusing on chapter 16, all about population ecology. So, objectives for this chapter, we're going to talk about all of the fundamentals about ecology and what ecology is and what makes it up. Talk about population growth and what factors impact population growth. Talk about life histories and all the different variations organisms can have in life histories. Talk about survivorship curves and the relationship between growth, reproduction, and survival, and the trade-offs with that. And then we'll go into aging and age pyramids and talk about the human population growth and how we all have an ecological footprint. So to start out, we're going to talk about what actually is ecology. So ecology is all about the study of the interactions between organisms, the actual creatures that we're studying, and their environment. How do those two components play off each other? How do the organisms interact with their environment? How does the environment impact the organisms? That relationship is all about ecology. So with ecology, we have a couple of key questions we focus on as ecologists. So the first one is, how many organisms are in a given population? Whether we're looking at a mammal population in a forest or a population of fish in the ocean, we want to know how many organisms actually make up that population for a local environment. Another important question we want to ask is, how many do we need to have a healthy population? So how many individuals or how big or small does that population need to be for that population to be stable? If it gets too big, it may spiral out of control and cause problems for other individuals and eventually crash, or it may be too small to even sustain itself and not last very long anyway. So populations need to be a certain size to be healthy. Lastly, in terms of the human aspect of ecology, we talk about economic profit with resources from the environment. So for example, with lobsters, the fishing industry is the fishing industry uses lobsters a lot for fishing because a lot of people like to eat lobsters. So obviously we fish lobsters a lot in the ocean, but if we keep overfishing, we will run out of all the lobsters we need to be able to make a business off of it. So while we want to maintain the fishing industry for lobsters or any other fish we're looking at, we need to make sure the population that we are fishing stays a certain amount so the population doesn't crash and ultimately we drive the species to extinction. Seafood's not the only example. We can see examples like this with timber as well. When we look at trees, cutting down how many trees in a forest for paper products or other usage. If we cut down the whole forest, then we don't have any more resources. So there's always economic trade-offs with leaving resources behind for less money, but ensuring that we have resources and longevity. So all of this is linked to ecology. So with ecology, we have several different levels. Now, at the beginning of the semester, I talked about how in biology we have a hierarchy of levels. And I talked about how things start at the cell level, go to tissues, then organs and organ systems and organisms. That's at the molecular level. At the ecological level, we start out at the smallest level, which is the individual, and then go to a population, community, and then ecosystem. So same sort of hierarchy, but now we're talking about a macro scale instead of a micro scale. So with these four layers of the hierarchy, an individual, the smallest level we have is just one individual organism. So one lobster is an individual, one squirrel of a squirrel population is an individual, just one organism makes up an individual. Then we have the second level, which is the population. And as we studied in the last unit, this is a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other. So in this example right here, we have all of these lobsters that are of the same species, are able to breed with one another and produce viable offspring. Next level we have is called a community. So a community is not just the population of one organism, but all of the populations of different organisms that interact with each other in a location. So in this example, we have a population of lobster, but we also have this population of fish, and this population of clams, and this population of sea urchins. So they all are populations that inhabit the same area, making a community. So think of community as all of the populations in the same area for all of the species. Lastly, we have an ecosystem, and the ecosystem is the highest level we can have for ecological hierarchy. And this is all the living organisms, so our community, plus all of the non-living elements in a certain area. So when we talk about non-living elements, we're talking about things like weather and salinity and pH and temperature. All of these non-living factors impact what can actually live in that environment. So ecosystem is community plus the non-living elements. So for ecology, we would think that we would like to start at the individual level since that's the smallest level, and that would tell us a lot more about the overall ecosystem. However, it's not really productive to actually look at the individual. That doesn't tell us very much about the ecosystem because we can't see evolutionary change because we know populations evolve, individuals don't. So when we look at ecology, we'd like to start at the population level. So again, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area and able to exchange genes. So they can interbreed, they can produce offspring. And when we look at a population, we are largely curious about how a population actually changes. Does it grow bigger? Does it grow smaller? Is it staying the same? Ultimately, we want to look at this aspect. And with population, when a population is stable, every individual in that population replaces itself, meaning that if there is one individual in the population, ideally that individual will contribute to the production of one offspring. So for every birth, there is a death. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And populations, of course, change. They're not always stable. Much of the time, populations are growing or shrinking. And with this population growth, we have what's called the growth rate. And that is the change in the number of individuals for a population of organisms we're looking at over some unit of time. So how many individuals are added to the population, how many are taken away over some interval. So it could be a month, it could be a year, it could be several years, it could be a decade, over some unit of time. Most of the time we look at growth rate over a year, so we're looking on a year-to-year basis. Now with growth rate, in order to actually calculate how big the population is growing, we have a couple factors we have to look at. So to find population growth, we have to look at the growth rate as well as the number of individuals in the population. So here's where things get a little bit math heavy, but I will walk you all through it. So the growth rate, we abbreviate as the variable R. That's just the rate of growth. And the rate of growth itself is equal to the birth rate, so how many new individuals are being born, minus the death rate, so how many individuals are dying. So that growth rate is just birth rate minus death rate. Then the second factor we have for population growth is the number of individuals in the population. This is represented by the variable N, or capital N. That's just number of individuals. So the actual growth rate formula is R, which is our growth rate, birth rate minus death rate, times N, the number of individuals in our population. So we will take an example where we have 500 individuals in the population. So our N, the number of individuals in the population, is 500. And we want to figure out how many individuals over the course of a year are going to be added to that population. So two pieces of information we are given says that over the course of the 1 year, we have 125 offspring that are born. So we need to know the birth rate and we need to know the death rate to find R. So our birth rate is 125 because we had 125 individuals born, divided by our N, which is 500, to get 0.25 births per person or per organism, whatever population we're looking at. Then we also have to consider the death rate. So if we have 25 individuals that die out of the 500 individuals during the course of the same year, the death rate is 25 divided by 500, our initial amount, or 0.05 deaths per person. So we have to find our growth rate now. Our growth rate is our birth rate minus our death rate. So our birth rate was 0.25 and our death rate was 0.05. So 0.25 minus 0.05 is 0.20 individuals per person per year. So our growth rate, or our R amount, is 0.20. So now we want to find the number of individuals that actually are added to the population over the course of that year. So we're going to take our R, which is 0.20, and multiply it by our N, which is 500, to get 100 individuals added to the population in that first year. So after the first year, we'll have a total of 600 individuals. We could then continue on to calculate the growth rate for the second, third, fourth year, etc., using that same logic. And we call this type of growth, this R times N, we call that exponential growth. So it's when a population's size increases at a rate proportional to its current size. So basically, the larger it gets, the more it grows, and the larger it gets, the more it grows. We call this unchecked population growth because there's nothing deterring the growth from happening. We're just starting with a certain number of individuals, and we are reproducing, producing more of them, and that rate is skyrocketing up without any cause or without any checks. However, exponential population growth is very, very unheard of because we have factors that limit population size. As the population gets larger, we have more competition. So you have more individuals. So you got to have more mouths to feed, more organisms that have to eat. So there's going to be competition for food, both between individuals of the same species, but also individuals between species, especially if they're sharing a resource. Additionally, you'll have competition over space. So you have more individuals packed into a tight amount of space. So now you're going to have individuals clashing over territory potentially, or breeding grounds. So you don't have as much space as you did, so that competition is going to go up. Additionally, with more individuals packed into a tight area, you're going to have higher incidences of parasites and disease. Perfect example of this with the coronavirus. We see many of our cities being hit really hard and having higher incidences of coronavirus cases because so many individuals are packed into such a small space that the disease is able to move from person to person much more quickly than if we were spread out in the suburbs or in the rural areas. Lastly, we have the increase of predation risk. So if a smaller organism, something like a rabbit, is populating and adding a lot more individuals to the population, there is now a larger food source for a lot of your predators to go after. So that's going to keep that population size in check. So with population growth, it's not just exponential, unchecked growth. We have a couple new terms to introduce. So the first one is population density, and this is just the number of individuals in a given area. So for example, St. Louis has about 300,000 individuals per the city. So that's the city's density. We then have what are called density-dependent factors, and these are conditions that limit our population growth to a certain size. So all of those characteristics I just listed, things like competition, things like parasites and disease and predation, those are all density-dependent factors because they all limit the size the population can grow to. And the ceiling, as it were, for the population size is what's called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is ultimately the maximum number of individuals that a population can have for a certain environment. The carrying capacity is going to be limited from environment to environment. Some environments have a lower carrying capacity, some have a higher one. It really depends on what the environment is, how many organisms live there, how much space there is, what kind of resources are there, what's the weather contributing to agriculture production. The list goes on and on. But the important thing to know with carrying capacity mathematically is that it is represented by the variable k. And that is going to come into play with some more math. So carrying capacity influences our growth. In terms of population growth, we know that exponentially, this is equal to R, which is the rate of growth, the birth rate minus the death rate, multiplied by N, the number of individuals in the population. So that's our exponential growth when we have no carrying capacity, no density-dependent factors. Of course, we do because we know all these things are present in nature. So we have a new mathematical variable to put into the formula, and that is this term right here. It is K, which is our carrying capacity, minus N, which is the number of individuals in the population, divided by K, again, our carrying capacity. So this will vary, this term will vary between 0 and 1. And ultimately, depending on how close to 0 or how close to 1 that number is, that's going to impact the rate of population growth. So the whole formula, when we talk about population growth, is going to be our exponential, which is our r times our n, times this new term right here, our k minus n divided by k. So all together, that's the rate of growth times the number of individuals in the population, times our term here, which is k, the carrying capacity, minus n, the number of individuals in the population, divided by k, the carrying capacity. So the new term, the k minus n divided by k, when that's close to 1, the population growth remains unchanged. Mathematically, what that means is that this whole formula right here, r times n times k minus n divided by k, if this term that I'm circling is close to 1, 1 times any number is just itself, which means that the population growth isn't changing at all. It's the same thing that it was. On the other hand, if we have the population get close to 0, we'll have population, or we'll have, if the term gets close to 0, we'll have the population growth get reduced to 0. An example we have here is showing that is with our carrying capacity being at 100,000 and our number of individuals in the population being at 99,000. So we're very close to our carrying capacity. But we have to solve for our k minus n divided by k. We take 1,000 individuals divided by 100,000 to get 0.01. So 0.01 is very, very close to 0, meaning the population growth is nearly 0. So if this term is close to 0 or almost 0, this term will be multiplied by the 0. So anything times 0 is 0, and the population growth will basically be nothing. The population isn't growing. So to recap all that, if k minus n divided by k is close to 1, the population growth remains unchanged. It's going to keep going the way it's going. If k minus n divided by k is 0, the population growth is going to be 0 because anything times 0 is 0. Okay. So we call this, these terms, the r times n times k minus n divided by k, we call this logistic growth because it's population growth that has stabilized because of competition, because of predation, because of limited resources. And what this looks like on a graph is that we have this S shape. So we start at the beginning, we start to go exponentially. So we start to have this dramatic increase, but because of limited resources, we start to have a leveling off near the carrying capacity K. So in our last example, we had the K of 100,000. That's this orange line right here. Our population growth starts to grow, and then as we approach K, our carrying capacity levels off and doesn't surpass that K amount. So logistic growth, it will always surpass K, or sorry, exponential growth will always pass K. Logistic growth will never pass K. Logistic growth is a much more realistic model for population growth than exponential. So we talked about density dependent factors and how those impact population growth in terms of things like predation, competition, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we have what's called density independent factors. And your book describes these as bad luck events, basically. These will limit population growth regardless of the size. So these occurrences could happen if the population is really large. They could even happen if the population is really small. They don't have anything to do with how many individuals are in an area. That's why we call them bad luck, because they just kind of happen. And typically, they are weather-based, so something like a lightning storm causing a forest fire or an earthquake due to geological shifting. Anything that causes habitat destruction is ultimately going to destroy habitat, reduce resources, potentially kill organisms from the catastrophe. All of those are independent of the size of the population. And if we look on this graph over here, we have population size on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. We see a little cycle of how this works. So when a population grows, it's getting more individuals. It can have a rapid decline, as we see by this red line here, from something like a forest fire, destroying a good amount of the population. We could then again have a spike in the number of individuals, have some other sort of catastrophe, maybe an earthquake, destroys a lot of the habitat or a lot of the organisms, and then we have a huge decline. Again, spike and decline. So instead of it being this nice curve where we have a growth and then a leveling off because of some limited resources or competition, like with logistic growth, in this case, we're just having basically booms and crashes because the density independent factors aren't gradually leveling out the population. They're just destroying some of it. So we have those models that I showed you. We have exponential when there's nothing checking the population growth. We have logistic when we have a more realistic view of the environment and how that impacts how big a population can be. But populations don't always exhibit what we call textbook growth patterns. So with biology, you know by this point from previous examples or previous units that we have a lot of models, we have a lot of examples. The Punnett square is a very rudimentary way to look at genetics. The Hardy-Weinberg is a really rudimentary way to look at allele frequencies. Same idea with exponential and logistic growth. They are models we use to help us understand. But in the real world, populations can always be more complex. For example, we have what's called population cycling. And this is when a population basically has these boom and crash periods, kind of like with your density independent factors. But in this case, this actually has a density dependent factor. So the example we have is that we have a lynx population, which is the natural predator of the snowshoe hare, which is this white guy right here. So on this graph, we have on the right, we have population size on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And our green or our darker green lines are snowshoe hares, so that's a prey. And our lynx population is this yellow line or lighter green yellow line there. So you'll see is that as we start to move across the x-axis, across time, the snowshoe hare population spikes and has a huge boom in population. What that does to the lynx population in the yellow is that because the hare population had an explosion, there's a lot more food around for the lynx. So the lynx now has a lot more opportunities to hunt and get food and reproduce. So because they have a lot more resources, the lynx population is also going to shoot up. In time, there's going to be a huge pressure of predation on the hare population. So because there's so much pressure and so many hares being killed, not that many are going to survive and to produce more and keep the population growing. So it's going to take a nosedive and dive way back down here. So since a lot of the hares now died, the major food source of the lynx population in yellow is now also going to take a dive because their food source just dried up. So now that we're down here again, the snowshoe hare population doesn't have as many predators around, so they are able to reproduce more able to survive, and this population size is able to skyrocket back up. And then we see the same thing with the lynx population. Food source now goes up. There's more lynx. Lynx are now able to get more food, produce more of themselves. And we see this constant wavering of booming and crashing with the lynx and the hare population because they're basically feeding off each other. When one does well, the other does well, which causes a crash of one and then the crash of the other. And this cycle constantly repeats over and over again, what we call the population oscillation, because it's oscillating between boom and bust. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about life history with natural selection. So we have population growth, and it can be logistic or exponential. But in terms of actually producing those offspring, organisms have to make choices, and organisms have different adaptations to ultimately decide when they should produce, how they should produce, what do they allocate their energy to. All of that is life history. So life history is basically these statistics that we have for a species. So age of reproduction, longevity, survival, all of these come into play. And some examples we have to show you the different kinds of variability that exist in the animal kingdom are the first one with this forest mouse. And this forest mouse utilizes what's called Big Bang reproduction. So basically, they are reproductively active for a 3-week period after sexually maturing for a year. So they reach sexual maturity after just a year. And then for a 3-week interval, they basically go crazy and have a lot of offspring. They mate a lot, have a lot of offspring, and then immediately after this 3-week binge, the males die all of a sudden, and then the females just produce a bunch of offspring from all the mating. So very short lifespan, matures very quickly, and has a very quick reproductive episode. Middle example we have with this house mouse. This has a fast, intensive reproductive investment, but not a big bang. What that means is that the mouse reaches sexual maturity after a month, so even less time than the forest rat. However, instead of having an explosive period where it's reproductively active for several weeks, the offspring or the house mouse reproduces every month, producing roughly 6 to 10 offspring. So still having a lot of offspring, just on a month-to-month basis instead of over a quick 3-week period. Then on the right, we have the little brown bat with an even more relaxed example, and they use slow, gradual reproduction. What that means is they take a whole year to reach sexual maturity, so instead of a month. And instead of producing several offspring every month, they are producing one offspring per year. So putting a lot more energy into just one offspring over a larger course of time and investing more into their own growth. So 3 very different reproductive strategies across these 3 mammals. So as I mentioned with life history, an organism's life history looks at several factors. So age of first reproduction, how old are you when you are first able to have offspring? Probabilities of survival and reproduction at each age. How likely are you to survive from one age to another? And how likely are you to have offspring successfully from one age to another? And those numbers might vary. You might be able to survive a lot when you're young and die or have a higher probability of death when you're older. Same with reproduction. Maybe you can't produce a lot of offspring early on, but you can produce a lot more offspring later. There's lots of different strategies and variations with this. Additionally, litter size and frequency. So how many offspring do you actually have per batch, quote unquote? And how often do you do this? Do you do this like in a giant 3-week period? Do you do it every month, every year? Lots of variability. And lastly, longevity. How long do you actually live? So some organisms only live a couple of weeks, like flies. Some organisms can live 100 years, like humans. Some organisms can live thousands of years, like trees. So longevity plays an important part as well. And with all this variability, we have to ask, which life history strategy is ultimately the best? Is there a winner and a loser? And 2 important questions to look at with this is, 1, what is the cost of reproduction investment during any reproductive episode? In other words, what is the risk of reproducing? During reproduction, organisms have to consider other factors like predation, that they're being exposed and not having their defenses up. Additionally, reproduction is costly. There is a wear and tear if you're having offspring after offspring after offspring, particularly on the female, that may not allow the offspring to survive, depending on how much physical stress the female has gone under. Additionally, the second question is, what is an individual's likelihood of surviving to have future reproductive episodes? In other words, how long do you delay reproduction? Do you try to reproduce early on in life because you sexually matured quickly, or do you delay sexual maturity later on so you can grow bigger and potentially have offspring later on because you won't get eaten, or if you've invested more energy into being able to have less offspring, but offspring more likely to survive? And ultimately, the answer to the question of which life history strategy is best is that natural selection favors lifetime reproductive success. So it doesn't matter if you produce a lot of offspring early on or you produce just a few offspring later on because you delayed sexual maturity. Whatever path you take, as long as you were able to successfully produce offspring, that is the correct answer. So there are multiple right answers with life history strategies. As long as you, again, able to survive, able to pass on your genes because you can produce more offspring, you have basically won the game of natural selection. But with all these strategies, like I said, there's multiple right answers, but there are trade-offs. So you can't do everything. You can grow, you can reproduce, and you can live a certain amount of time, but you can't be amazing at all of these things. Ideally, we would all be able to, or any organism, would be able to have a bunch of offspring year after year, just keep pumping out babies. You'd be able to grow really large, so you wouldn't be able to have any predators. You'd be the top dog, and you'd live forever. So you wouldn't actually have to die. You could just keep passing on your genes because you keep having offspring because you exist forever. But we know that's not the case. We know organisms can only produce a certain number of offspring, usually during certain periods of our life. Not everyone grows forever. Organisms have a lot of variability in size, and we know everyone dies. So with these trade-offs, there are lots of different variabilities, like I mentioned, with the different mammals. And when they make the trade-offs, they are making a compromise between two things. Something like growth, survival, reproduction, survival, number of offspring, and offspring size. There's a million trade-offs organisms can make. But the idea is you can try and put a lot of energy into one thing and be really good at one thing, but not as good as the other. Or you can kind of divvy up your energy between different things like growth, reproduction, survival, and kind of take the middle path. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. There's just different strategies. So to go through some of those strategies and show some examples with life history trade-offs. On the left, we have a trade-off between reproduction and survival. With this, we have an example of salmon. So salmon produce have a really high investment in reproduction. So they're putting a lot of energy and time into being able to produce more offspring. So they are very good at producing those offspring. However, those salmon die very shortly afterwards. So they don't really invest a lot of energy into their survival. They put all their eggs in the reproductive basket and hope that they can produce offspring that will survive, even if they don't. Second trade-off we have is with reproduction and growth. And this example we have with beech trees is that beech trees grow really, really slowly and take a really long time to get to maturity. So they essentially delay their reproductive onset for many, many, many years until they can get to a certain size that they feel comfortable, well, they're able to produce offspring. So it takes many, many years, and they delay that onset, but by that time, they're able to more successfully reproduce than if they were to have sexual maturity early on. So they delay reproduction in terms of putting more energy into growth. An example that's sort of intermediate is with the number and size of offspring. So in this example, we have a female lizard, and female lizards lay eggs, as many reptiles do. And basically, eggs can be laid in that you can have very large eggs, but not a lot of them. You can have, you can have very few eggs that are big. You can have a lot of eggs that are small, or you can have sort of an intermediate amount of eggs that are of medium size. And that's what these female lizards do. So they pick a middle route. They pick a middle number of eggs that are of medium size. So they invest some energy into the number of offspring, but also some energy into making sure those offspring are of quality and will actually survive. All right, and I will stop there for part 1 and be right back for part 2.